Tonight, we're stepping into a world where winter wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a test you could fail with your life. Medieval peasants didn't have thermostats or insulated walls. They had mud, straw, and stubborn determination. Let's see how they survived nights that would send most of us running for the nearest hospital. Before we begin, if you find yourself drifting along with this journey, a like helps others discover these stories. Subscribe if you'd like more calm explorations of forgotten histories. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what the temperature is where you are. It puts things in perspective. Now settle in. Maybe pull your blanket a little closer. Appreciate your warm bed. Because we're about to spend the next few hours in a world where warmth was earned, not given. Where survival was a skill, not a guarantee. Dim the lights if you'd like. Let the quiet rhythm of history ease you toward sleep. We're traveling back 7 or 8 centuries to drafty cottages and smoky rooms, to nights where the line between alive and frozen was thinner than you'd think. Chapter 1. When Winter Wasn't Cozy. When you think of medieval times, you might picture castles and knights, feasts and festivals. But for the vast majority of people, the peasants who worked the land, winter meant something very different. It meant endurance. It meant suffering. It meant the possibility of not seeing spring. Winter arrived every year like a cruel examination, testing whether you'd prepared well enough, whether your house was sealed tightly enough, whether you'd stored enough food and fuel. And it lasted. November to March, sometimes longer. Month after month of cold that crept into everything, that turned breath to fog and water to ice. Inside a medieval peasant home on a winter night, the temperature was barely above freezing. If it was 20 degrees outside, it might be 30 degrees inside. That was victory. The walls, thin constructions of woven sticks and mud, provided some shelter from wind and snow, but they didn't provide warmth. That had to come from elsewhere. At night, darkness arrived early and completely. No streetlights, no electric glow, just blackness, broken only by the dim orange flicker of the hearth fire. The wind howled around corners and through gaps. It found every crack, every weak point, every place where the mud had crumbled or the thatch had pulled away. Children huddled close to their parents. Grandparents wrapped themselves in every piece of cloth they owned. Everyone understood the stakes. Frostbite was real. It blackened fingers and toes, turned extremities numb and dead. Hypothermia was real. It made you sleepy, confused, and then it killed you quietly. Every morning that you woke, still breathing, still able to move your limbs, was a small victory. Another night survived. Another day earned. Winter wasn't romantic. It wasn't cozy. It was a months-long battle against an enemy that never tired, never retreated, never showed mercy. The cold came from above, where the thatched roof let in drafts and occasionally snow. It came from the sides, through walls that were more suggestion than barrier. But the worst cold came from below, from the frozen earth itself, radiating up through whatever thin layers separated you from the ground. Medieval peasants didn't conquer winter. They endured it. They survived it through cleverness, community, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. Night after night, family after family, village after village, they held the line between alive and frozen. And somehow, impossibly, most of them made it to spring. And the battlefield for this fight wasn't outside. It was right inside their homes. Chapter 2. Houses Made of Hope. Let's be clear about what we mean by house in medieval peasant terms. We're not talking about sturdy structures with proper foundations and weather-tight walls. We're talking about shelters, modest attempts to separate inside from outside with varying degrees of success. The most common construction method was called wattle and daub. It sounds almost charming when you say it quickly. The reality was less charming. Wattle was the frame, thin wooden branches, hazel or willow usually woven together like a giant basket.
Imagine the world's largest, roughest piece of furniture shaped into walls. Then came the daub. This was the covering, the substance meant to fill the gaps and create an actual barrier. And what was daub made of? Well, clay or mud formed the base. Straw was mixed in for structure, to keep the mud from cracking as it dried. And then, for extra binding and waterproofing, animal dung was added to the mixture. Yes, dung. Cow manure, usually, since cows were plentiful and their digestive output was reliably abundant. Before you recoil completely, understand the logic. Dung was free and constantly available. It was sticky, helping the mixture adhere to the wattle frame. And when dried, it actually did provide some insulation and water resistance. Peasants weren't using dung because they enjoyed it. They were using it because it worked, and because they had no better options. These daub walls, once dried, were surprisingly durable. In good conditions, they could last years. But good conditions didn't include harsh medieval winters. The mud cracked as it dried. The wattle frame shifted and warped. Wind and rain gradually eroded the protective coating, revealing gaps where cold air could enter. By winter, even a well-maintained house had dozens of small openings, cracks, and weak spots. The wind found every single one. Your drafty apartment, the one where you can feel a breeze from that window that doesn't quite close right? Medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty. They were basically enthusiastic collaborations with the outside weather, providing nominal protection while allowing generous ventilation. Think of it as
living inside a very large, very rough basket that someone smeared with mud and hoped for the best. Now place that basket in the middle of a field during a winter storm. That's closer to the reality. The roof was equally problematic. Thatch, dried straw, reeds, or grasses bundled and layered, was the standard roofing material. It was cheap, renewable, and surprisingly effective when new. But thatch didn't stay new. Rain soaked it, making it heavy and causing it to sag. Snow accumulated on it, adding weight and finding ways to melt through. Wind pulled at it, dislodging bundles and creating gaps. After a season or two, thatched roofs developed leaks. Little drips at first, then more ambitious streams. And in winter, those leaks meant melting snow dripping onto your already miserable sleeping area. Occasionally, small animals made homes in the thatch. Mice, birds, squirrels. They were warmer up there than you were down below, which should tell you something. Windows were rare and small when they existed at all. Glass was expensive beyond imagination for peasants. A single small pane cost more than most families earned in months. So windows, when present, were simply holes in the wall, covered with wooden shutters, or, if you were fortunate, oiled cloth or animal hide stretched thin to let in some light. In winter, these holes were covered completely. You chose between light and cold was more dangerous than darkness. The entire structure, this house of woven sticks and mud and hope, sat directly on the ground. No raised foundation, no air gap, no barrier between the frozen earth and the interior, which meant the cold had easy access from below, from the sides, and from above. A three-dimensional siege. And yet, peasants made these houses work. They patched and stuffed and sealed. They added layers when they could. They made repairs constantly, because this fragile shelter was the only thing standing between them and the full force of winter. But the walls weren't even the worst part. The real cold came from below. Chapter 3. The ground beneath. Floors in medieval peasant homes weren't really floors in any sense we'd recognize. They were ground, earth, dirt packed down from years of walking, but still fundamentally just the outdoor surface moved slightly indoors. No wood planks, no tile, no stone except in rare cases,
and then only near the hearth to prevent fire spread. Just dirt. In summer, this wasn't terrible. Dirt stayed reasonably dry, could be swept clean enough, and stayed cool when everything else was hot. In winter, dirt floors became instruments of torture. The ground froze solid from December through February in much of medieval Europe. That frozen earth extended down several feet, creating a vast reservoir of cold directly beneath where you slept. And cold radiates upward. It seeps through straw, through bedding, through layers of cloth. It finds your body and draws heat away relentlessly, all night, every night.
Peasants tried to combat this with floor coverings. Straw was the most common option, scattered in thick layers across the entire interior. When fresh, straw provided some insulation. It created an air gap between your body and the frozen earth. It was better than nothing, which was the usual medieval benchmark. But straw compressed under foot traffic. It absorbed moisture from the air, from spills, from general household dampness. And compressed, damp straw provided very little insulation. It also attracted life. Fleas, lice, mites, all manner of tiny creatures that fed on organic matter and, conveniently, on humans. The straw layer became an ecosystem unto itself. Replacing the straw was a major undertaking, done perhaps twice a year if you were diligent. You'd clear out the old, trampled, flea-ridden layer and spread fresh straw. For a few days, the house smelled almost pleasant, like fields and harvest. Then life returned to normal, and the new straw began its journey toward becoming the old straw. Another floor covering option was rushes. These long grasses grew in wet areas, were cut in summer, and dried for winter use. They were softer than straw, more flexible. Some wealthier peasants mixed herbs into the rushes: lavender, rosemary, meadowsweet. The herbs released scent when crushed underfoot, temporarily masking the other odors that defined medieval indoor life. But like straw, rushes compressed, grew damp, and fostered pest populations. And like straw, they did very little to prevent cold from radiating up from the frozen earth below. At night, lying on your straw mattress, you could feel it. The cold creeping up from underneath, seeping through the bedding, finding your back, your hips, your legs. You'd shift position, trying to find a warmer spot, but there were no warmer spots. The entire floor was equally cold. The entire earth was frozen solid. Modern sleeping bags have insulated bottoms specifically to prevent ground cold. Medieval peasants had more straw and the hope that their body heat could warm the immediate area faster than the frozen earth could cool it. Usually, the earth won. Children, smaller and less able to generate heat, suffered especially. Parents would place them in the middle of communal sleeping arrangements, surrounded by adult bodies, trying to shield them from the cold coming from below. The elderly, whose circulation was poor, whose bodies generated less heat, felt the ground cold acutely. They wrapped themselves in extra layers, positioned themselves near the hearth, and still shivered through the nights. If you dropped something on the floor during a winter night, a cup, a tool, anything metal, it would be painfully cold to pick up by morning. The floor itself acted as a massive heat sink, drawing warmth from everything it touched. This is what we mean when we talk about medieval cold. It wasn't just air temperature. It was cold from all directions simultaneously, inescapable and relentless. The frozen ground beneath them was an enemy they couldn't defeat, couldn't negotiate with. They could only minimize its impact through layers and positioning and sheer endurance. Every night was an exercise in tolerating discomfort. Every morning was a relief that the night was over. With cold coming from below and drafts from all sides, peasants needed a hero. Enter the hearth. Chapter 4. The Smoking Heart. If medieval peasant homes had a single vital organ, it was the hearth. Everything revolved around this fire pit, literally and figuratively. The hearth was positioned centrally in most single-room dwellings. It was often just a pit lined with stones or clay, though some homes had raised platforms of stone or brick. No fireplace in the sense we understand it, no chimney, at least not in the early medieval period, just a fire burning on the floor or on a platform, with smoke rising and going somewhere eventually. The somewhere was usually up. Smoke drifted toward the roof, where holes had been left specifically for venting. In theory, the smoke exited through these holes. In practice, much of it lingered. Medieval peasant homes were chronically smoky. Your eyes watered constantly. Your throat felt raw. Everything you owned, clothes, bedding, your own hair, smelled permanently of wood smoke. But the alternative was freezing to death, so smoke was accepted as the lesser evil. The fire itself was fed with whatever could be burned. Wood, when available, which became less available as forests were cleared for farmland. Peat in areas where it could be dug from bogs. Dried dung, which burned slowly and provided some heat. Gathering fuel was a year-round activity, but especially critical before winter. Families spent autumn collecting, cutting, drying, and storing anything that would burn. Running out of fuel midwinter was catastrophic. It meant begging from neighbors, burning furniture, or simply enduring the cold with no mitigation. Some families didn't survive running out of fuel. The hearth fire served multiple purposes beyond warmth. It was the only cooking surface, the only light source after sunset, and the social center where families gathered. Stories were told by firelight. Repairs were made near the fire where you could see your work. Children played in the small, warm zone extending a few feet from the flames. But that warm zone was deceptively small. If you sat directly in front of the fire, you roasted. Your face grew hot, your front side almost uncomfortably warm. Meanwhile, your back was freezing. The cold air behind you, the constant drafts, ensured that heat never distributed evenly. You'd rotate like a rotisserie chicken, warming one side, then the other, never quite comfortable, never quite warm all over. Step 6 feet away from the fire, and you might as well have been outside. The heat dissipated quickly, absorbed by the cold air, the cold walls, the cold ground. At night, sleeping arrangements were strategic. The most vulnerable, infants, the elderly, the sick, got the spots closest to the fire. Parents and older children formed outer layers. But even prime spots had dangers. Too close to the fire, and embers could jump onto bedding, clothing, hair. Burns were common. House fires killed entire families when something caught and spread. The hearth fire required constant attention. Letting it die down too much meant losing your heat source. But letting it build too high meant risking fire spread or wasting precious fuel. Someone always had responsibility for the fire. During the day, it rotated among family members. At night, well, we'll get to the night watch soon. The smoke, while annoying and unhealthy, did have one benefit. It fumigated the house, killing or driving away some of the insects that plagued medieval life. Fleas disliked heavy smoke. So did many other pests. Whether the trade-off, constant respiratory irritation for reduced flea populations, was worth it is debatable. But peasants didn't have the luxury of choice. They breathed the smoke, they tended the fire, they managed the delicate balance between warmth and safety. The hearth was the beating heart of medieval winter survival. Without it, life simply wasn't possible in northern European winters. The fire sputtered and crackled, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. The smoke rose in lazy spirals, stinging eyes and throat. The warmth spread perhaps 4 feet before dissipating into cold air, and families huddled as close as they dared, rotating periodically, feeding the flames with precious fuel, and praying the wood would last until spring. But keeping that fire alive through the night? That required a trick passed down through generations. Chapter 5. Banking the Ember. As night deepened and the family prepared for sleep, one critical task remained. The fire had to be banked. Banking the fire was an art form, taught from parent to child, essential for survival. The concept was simple. Preserve the embers overnight without active tending, so the fire could be easily revived at dawn. The execution was more complex. First, you let the fire burn down to coals, not flames. Flames consumed fuel too quickly and couldn't be safely buried. But coals, glowing red-orange, radiating heat, lasting for hours. Then came the ash. You carefully scraped ash from the edges of the fire pit, the accumulated powdery remains of previous fires, and you covered the coals completely. The ash layer acted as insulation. It slowed the coals burning, reduced oxygen flow, and kept them hot without allowing them to burn out completely. Too much ash, and you'd smother the coals entirely, killing them. Too little, and they'd burn through the night and leave only cold, gray powder by morning. The right amount was learned through experience, through failures that meant freezing mornings, trying desperately to restart fire with flint and steel, and frozen fingers. Some families swore by damp ash, claiming the moisture content helped regulate temperature. Others insisted on bone-dry ash only. Arguments over proper banking technique could get surprisingly heated. Different regions had different methods. Some banked in a dome shape, ash piled high over coals. Others preferred spreading coals in a line and covering with a thin, even ash layer. What mattered was the result. Embers that survived until morning, when you could rake away the ash, add kindling, blow gently to encourage flames, and restart your day with fire. Because the alternative, the fire dying completely, was genuinely dangerous. Restarting fire from scratch required a flint stone and a steel striker. You scraped steel against flint, producing sparks, which you directed onto a nest of tinder, dry moss, charred cloth, very fine, dry grass. If you were lucky, a spark caught. If you were blessed, that tiny glowing point could be coaxed into flame with careful blowing, gentle addition of kindling, and much patience. If you were unlucky, if the tinder was damp, if your hands were too cold to hold the tools steady, if the wind kept blowing out your spark, you could spend hours trying to make fire. Hours in a freezing house with hungry children, with no way to cook food or boil water or create warmth. This is why neighbors would rush over with coals if they learned someone's fire had died. A live ember, bundled in rags, carried quickly, could restart a hearth and save a family. This is why banking the fire mattered so desperately. At night, after the fire was properly banked, the household settled for sleep. The ash-covered coals glowed faintly, barely visible, radiating minimal heat. The temperature dropped steadily. The banked fire provided some warmth, but nothing like the active flames of daytime. You wrapped yourself in everything you owned and hoped your body heat was enough. Some families arranged sleeping positions radially around the hearth, like spokes of a wheel, everyone's head toward the slightly warm center. Others formed lines, with the fire at one end and bodies arranged in order of vulnerability, most protected near the heat. Children learned early not to disturb the banked fire. A curious toddler could scatter the ash, expose the coals, and either burn themselves or kill the fire. Either outcome was bad. Through the night, the coals burned slowly, sustained by the small amount of oxygen reaching them through the ash covering. By dawn, they'd be diminished, but alive. The first person to wake, usually whoever had last shift of the night watch, would approach the hearth with kindling ready. Rake away some ash, revealing the coals. Check for that telltale glow. If the glow was there, relief. Add kindling carefully, blow gently, coax flames back to life. the new day's fire born from last night's careful preservation. If the coals were dead, cold gray ash and nothing more, then came the long, hard work of making new fire, and the knowledge that you'd failed at one of winter's most important tests. Most mornings, the embers survived. Most mornings, fire returned. Most mornings, the family woke to the smell of wood smoke and the promise of warmth. But every morning was uncertain until you checked the coals. Every evening's banking was a gamble you couldn't afford to lose. Even with a banked fire, heat alone wasn't enough. Peasants needed to become heat themselves. Chapter 6. The Human Pile. Medieval peasants learned a fundamental truth about winter survival. Human bodies generate heat, and that heat can be shared. The more bodies pressed together, the warmer everyone stayed. It was simple thermodynamics, applied without understanding the science, but with complete appreciation of the results. Privacy, as a concept, didn't really exist for peasant families anyway. A single-room home housing 6 or 8 people doesn't allow for privacy. But winter made closeness mandatory, not just inevitable. At night, the family didn't spread out to individual sleeping spaces. They clustered, they piled. They created a communal warm zone through sheer density of human bodies. The sleeping arrangements were strategic, not random. This was survival logistics, refined over generations. The center of the sleeping cluster was reserved for those most vulnerable to cold. Infants who couldn't generate enough body heat and couldn't tell you they were freezing. The elderly, whose circulation was poor and whose bodies struggled to maintain temperature. Around them, the children. Not babies, but young kids who needed protection, but also provided their own heat once surrounded by others. The outer layer consisted of adults in their prime, parents, older teenagers, anyone with good health and strong circulation. They formed a human shield, their backs to the cold, their fronts radiating warmth inward. It was like a heat engine, with the most vulnerable at the warm core and the most resilient forming an insulating shell. The sleeping surface was communal too, a large straw-stuffed mattress, or simply a thick layer of straw on the floor, covered with whatever cloth or old clothing could be spared. Everyone lay on this together. As the night progressed and people shifted, the straw compressed and redistributed. By morning, it was a flattened, body-shaped depression, and everyone had to extract themselves from the human tangle. Bodies pressed against bodies. You could feel your siblings breathing, your parents' heartbeat. There was no such thing as personal space. If you were lucky enough to be in the middle, you were genuinely warm, surrounded on all sides by heat sources. You might actually sleep comfortably. If you were on the edge, and someone had to be on the edge, you felt the cold at your back all night. One side warm, one side freezing, and sleep came in uncomfortable fits. The edge positions rotated somewhat, though adults usually took them voluntarily, protecting children from the worst of the cold. During the night, people moved unconsciously. Someone would shift, seeking a more comfortable position, and inadvertently shove someone else toward the cold outer edge. This led to grogginess complaints, elbowing, and general irritation. You'd push back, trying to reclaim your spot in the warm zone, and someone else would mumble protests. It was a nightly dance of discomfort, no one sleeping particularly well, everyone making do. Snoring was a particular challenge. In a warm, private room, snoring is annoying. In a freezing single room with 8 people piled together, snoring becomes a test of familial love. You couldn't go sleep somewhere else. There was nowhere else. You endured, or you woke the snorer, or you tried to drown it out with your own exhaustion. Despite the discomfort, the system worked. Body heat shared is body heat multiplied. A pile of humans generates surprising warmth, enough to mean the difference between surviving the night and not. Medieval records rarely mention these intimate details of daily life. They were too common, too obvious to record. But occasionally you find references to the family bed. or to the importance of keeping children well surrounded at night. These are echoes of the human pile, the communal sleeping arrangement that was simply how winter was survived. Modern people, used to individual beds and personal space, might find this horrifying. Medieval peasants would have found our isolated sleeping arrangements bizarre and dangerously wasteful of heat. Different times, different priorities. Theirs was survival. Ours is comfort. They survived through closeness, through sharing warmth, through accepting that winter meant sacrificing privacy for the sake of waking up alive. And it worked. Night after night, winter after winter, generation after generation. But humans weren't the only bodies providing warmth in the medieval bedroom. Chapter 7. Your Roommates. The Livestock. If you think sharing your sleeping space with siblings and parents was the limit of medieval bedroom crowding, think again. Because on the coldest nights, the family was joined by some rather large, rather aromatic roommates. The livestock came indoors. This wasn't a sign of lack of space or poor planning. It was deliberate strategy. Animals, particularly large ones, generate significant body heat. A cow is essentially a four-legged radiator, warm-blooded and obligingly stationary during nighttime hours. In milder weather, animals might be kept in attached structures, lean-tos built against the house, or separate sheds nearby. But in deep winter, in the coldest regions, animals moved into the main living space. Cows were prized for their warmth. A single cow positioned near the family sleeping area could raise the local temperature by several degrees. That's significant when the baseline is barely above freezing. Cows are also large and difficult to steal if they're sleeping 3 feet from you. Livestock theft was a real concern, and an indoor cow was a secure cow. Goats served similar purposes. Smaller than cows, but still warm, and more likely to force their way indoors whether invited or not. Goats are determined creatures, and if they believed the indoors was warmer, they'd find a way in. Pigs, despite being somewhat smaller, generated decent heat and had no concerns about personal boundaries. A pig would happily plop down wherever seemed warmest, often directly in front of the fire, forcing humans to navigate around them. Chickens roosted wherever they could find purchase. Rafters were popular, giving chickens a higher position and humans a reason to watch where they walked in the morning. The arrangement was practical, but came with significant downsides, the most obvious being smell. Animals produce waste continuously. They don't excuse themselves to use facilities outside. Everything happened right there, in the shared living space. By midwinter, a peasant home that housed livestock indoors had developed what we might call a rich, aromatic profile. A blend of animal waste, unwashed human bodies, wood smoke, and damp straw. Medieval peasants developed selective noses. When everyone and everything smells, nothing smells. Olfactory fatigue is a real phenomenon, and peasants lived in a state of permanent nose blindness. Besides, the alternative was freezing. Smell versus death isn't much of a contest. The animals themselves seemed content enough with the arrangements. They were warm, they were fed, they were safe from predators and thieves. If confused about why humans wanted to sleep near them, they didn't complain. Cows would chew their cud rhythmically, a wet, grinding sound that became part of the nighttime soundscape. Peaceful in its way, once you got used to it. Pigs snorted and grunted in their sleep. They occasionally got up to investigate interesting smells, snuffling around the room, sometimes waking sleeping humans with cold, wet snouts. Goats, being goats, did goat things. They chewed on anything remotely edible, including things that weren't remotely edible. They had opinions about sleeping arrangements, and expressed those opinions through bleating at inconvenient hours. Chickens were relatively quiet at night, but made up for it at dawn, announcing sunrise with enthusiastic crowing or clucking, often inches from sleeping human ears. Despite these challenges, the animals paid their rent in warmth. Their large bodies radiated heat continuously. The air near a sleeping cow was noticeably warmer than the air 6 feet away. Strategic animal positioning became another survival skill. Cows near the sleeping area, but not so close they could accidentally step on people. Goats near, but contained. Pigs wherever they decided, because arguing with a pig is rarely productive. Children learned early to sleep through animal noises. They learned to avoid the areas where waste accumulated. They learned which animals were safe to snuggle against and which had unpredictable temperaments. The line between barn and home blurred completely in winter. You all lived together, humans and animals, in mutually beneficial warmth-sharing arrangements. Modern people who balk at pets sleeping in their bedrooms would be horrified. Medieval peasants would be horrified at the wastefulness of heating separate structures for animals. Come spring, the animals would move back outdoors. The house would be thoroughly cleaned, or at least the worst of the accumulated winter mess would be removed. Fresh air would circulate. But next winter, the animals would return. The cycle continued, year after year, because it worked. Because cold kills and warm bodies survive, whether those bodies have 2 legs or 4. With animals inside and family huddled close, peasants still needed one more layer of protection: their clothes. Chapter 8: Layers of Survival. Medieval winter fashion had one goal: don't die. Style, elegance, and aesthetic appeal never entered the conversation. The basic approach was simple: own very few items of clothing and wear all of them simultaneously. The innermost layer, for those who had it, was a linen or hemp shirt. These plant fiber fabrics absorbed sweat somewhat, though they rarely saw washing in winter months. Over the undershift came a woolen tunic. Wool was the primary fabric of medieval life for good reason. It retained some warming properties even when damp. It was durable, and it was available, produced from sheep that every village kept. The wool wasn't soft. This wasn't merino or cashmere. This was rough, scratchy, occasionally itchy wool, spun and woven by people with more important concerns than comfort. You wore this woolen tunic day and night. It became a sort of mobile insulation, a personal layer between your skin and the cold world. Over the tunic came another layer if you owned one. Perhaps a second, heavier tunic. Perhaps a long vest or sleeveless overgarment. Anything that added thickness. Then, the cloak. This outer layer, usually wool again, was the main defense against wind. Cloaks could be wrapped tightly around the body, covering the arms and torso, providing a windbreak. Cloaks smelled universally of sheep, smoke, and whatever you'd been doing in them. They were rarely cleaned, never washed in winter, and became faithful companions that you literally wrapped yourself in every day. The layering extended to the lower body too. Leggings or hose, woolen tubes that covered the legs, were worn under tunics. These often bagged at the knees, stretched out of shape, and required constant adjustment. Feet received special attention because frostbite loved extremities. If you were fortunate, you owned shoes, leather pieces shaped roughly like feet and tied on. More commonly, you wrapped your feet in strips of cloth, layer upon layer, creating padded bundles. These cloth-wrapped feet, then, went into wooden clogs, or simply remained wrapped. The cloth wrapping method added insulation, but absorbed moisture from sweat and snow. By midwinter, your foot wrappings were damp, smelly, and increasingly ineffective. But they were what you had. Hands suffered similarly. Gloves were luxury items. Most peasants wrapped hands in cloth strips when doing outdoor work, or simply endured numb fingers as the price of winter survival. Heads could be covered with woolen caps, pulled down over ears. Again, these were rarely washed, accumulated their own ecosystem of dirt and oil, and smelled like everything else. The total effect of full winter layering was bulk. You looked like a lumpy cloth creature, waddling more than walking, restricted in movement but marginally warmer. Children, small and vulnerable to cold, were layered until they resembled overstuffed dolls. They could barely move their arms, but could survive playing outside for brief periods. The weight of all these layers was significant. Wool, especially damp wool, is heavy. By the end of winter, you'd spent months carrying around pounds of fabric. Taking off layers wasn't really an option. The house was barely warmer than outside. You might remove the outer cloak indoors, but everything else stayed on day and night. This meant sleeping in the same clothes you'd worn all day. You'd lie down in your tunic, your hose, your undershirt if you had one. You'd pull the cloak over yourself as an additional blanket. By morning, you'd wake up in the same clothes, slightly more compressed and body-warmed, ready to start another day without the effort of getting dressed. The line between clothing and bedding blurred. Anything fabric, anything that could hold in body heat, served both purposes interchangeably. And washing? Washing required water, which required melting snow or breaking stream ice. It required soap, which was expensive. It required drying time, which in winter took days. Wet clothes in winter could be fatal. The evaporation drew heat from your body. So clothes simply weren't washed from November to March. They accumulated dirt, sweat, oils from skin, smoke from the fire, bits of straw and animal debris, food particles, all of it layering into the fabric. And here's where things get interesting. Because that accumulated grime, it actually helped. But the real insulation secret? It wasn't another layer of cloth. It was dirt. Chapter 9. Strategic Filth. This is where medieval winter survival becomes counterintuitive to modern sensibilities. The dirt wasn't just tolerated, it was functional. Let's start with clean fabric. Wool or linen, freshly washed and dried, has a certain weave structure. The fibers have space between them, allowing air circulation. That air circulation is what we call breathable fabric. Breathability is wonderful in summer. It allows sweat to evaporate, prevents overheating, keeps you comfortable. In winter, when the outside air temperature is well below freezing, breathability is your enemy. Every air exchange is replacing warm air trapped near your body with freezing air from outside. This is where strategic filth comes in. As you wear clothing day after day without washing, several things accumulate in the fabric. Natural body oils, dirt from work and daily life, particles of smoke and ash, a certain biological patina. These accumulations fill in the gaps between fibers. They reduce the fabric's breathability. They create a denser, more windproof barrier. Essentially, dirt became a primitive form of weatherproofing. The grimy tunic was more effective at blocking wind than the clean tunic had been. Medieval peasants understood this empirically, even if they didn't know the science. They knew that their winter clothes worked better after they'd been worn for weeks without washing. There was even a belief, common in many regions, that washing yourself too frequently in winter was dangerous to health. The reasoning varied, removing protective layers, opening pores to cold, disturbing natural balances. The medical theory was wrong, but the practical effect was the same. People didn't bathe in winter. They didn't wash clothes in winter, and they survived. The smell, of course, was powerful. By February, a peasant wearing 5 months of unwashed, layered clothing smelled like concentrated humanity, with notes of smoke, animal, and decomposition. But here's the thing. Everyone smelled. Your family smelled. Your neighbors smelled. The animals smelled. The house itself smelled. When everything smells, your nose adjusts. It stops registering the constant background odor. You become nose blind to your own stench and everyone else's. Only in spring, when clothes were finally removed and washed and people bathed for the first time in months, would the full horror of winter's accumulation become briefly apparent. Then summer would come, bringing its own smells, and life would continue. The dirt buildup served another purpose too. It added a small amount of insulation through sheer thickness. The layer of grime was a thin but measurable addition to the fabric's insulating properties. Modern outdoor survival guides mention something similar. If you're lost in cold conditions with no shelter, don't remove your clothes even if they're dirty. The layers, however foul, are keeping you warmer than bare skin would be. Medieval peasants were unknowing experts in this principle. Their filthy clothes were survival gear. The strategic nature of winter grime extended to skin as well. Medieval people believed that natural body oils protected against cold. Washing them away was thought to leave you vulnerable. Again, the theory was dubious, but the practice of not bathing in winter was nearly universal among peasants. They went months without more than occasional face and hand washing. The skin's natural oils did provide a tiny bit of moisture barrier. Combined with the dirt and oils in clothing, you had something approaching water resistance, useful when snow inevitably made contact. To be clear, this was not healthy by modern standards. Skin conditions flourished, infections were common, parasites thrived in the unwashed conditions. But medieval medicine had no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no effective treatments for most conditions anyway. The choice was between smelling terrible and maybe getting a skin infection versus being definitely colder and still maybe getting a skin infection. They chose warmth. Children were taught that winter meant accepting the dirt, that scratching the inevitable itches was normal, that everyone looked and smelled like this, so there was no shame in it. Come spring, there would be washing. Clothes would be boiled if possible, or at least thoroughly soaked and beaten against rocks. Bodies would be scrubbed, hair would be combed and cleaned. But that was spring's concern. Winter's concern was staying alive. And if filth helped accomplish that, then filth was welcome. Modern people with daily showers and washing machines might recoil from this reality. Medieval peasants would probably recoil from how much heat energy we waste heating water just to wash away our protective dirt layers. Different priorities, different world. In medieval winter, filth wasn't failure. It wasn't a sign of giving up. It was strategic adaptation, a layer of insulation you grew rather than wove. And underneath all that strategic grime, underneath the layers of wool and linen and accumulated winter, were bodies that still needed rest. Wearing their filth armor, peasants still needed somewhere to sleep. Enter the straw bed. Chapter 10. Beds of Straw and Regret. The word bed deserves heavy quotation marks when applied to medieval peasant sleeping arrangements. What we mean is more like designated sleeping area with some organic padding. Those who could afford the wood and had the skill might have a bed frame. 4 corner posts, wooden slats, or rope webbing stretched between them, creating an elevated sleeping platform. This elevation was valuable. It got you slightly farther from the frozen ground, and in houses that flooded or allowed mud seepage, it kept you out of the worst dampness. But most peasants slept more simply, either directly on the floor's straw layer or on a large sack stuffed with straw placed on the floor. The straw-stuffed sack was the medieval mattress. Imagine a large cloth bag, coarse fabric, filled with hay or straw and sewn shut. When fresh, it was thick and provided some cushioning. You could almost call it comfortable if your standards had been appropriately lowered by medieval life. But straw compresses rapidly under weight. After a few nights of family sleeping on it, the mattress became thinner, lumpy, uneven. The straw inside broke down into smaller pieces, developed an interesting, crunchy texture, and began to smell of general organic decay. Every movement on a straw mattress produced sound. A rustling, crackling symphony that meant deep sleep was difficult. Roll over, and the entire bed announced your movement. Sharp bits of straw worked their way through the cloth covering. You'd discover them suddenly, a pointed jab in your back or leg, requiring adjustment and more rustling. These mattresses were changed seasonally, if that. Spring and fall, you'd empty the old straw, which by now was flattened, possibly moldy, definitely pest-ridden, and fill the sack with fresh material. This gave you perhaps 2 weeks of relatively comfortable sleeping before the new straw began its inevitable journey toward becoming old straw. Some households didn't bother with the sack. They simply spread straw directly on the floor in a thick layer, designating that as the sleeping area. You'd burrow into it, cover yourself with cloaks, and hope the insulation was sufficient. This method had the advantage of easy refresh. You could add new straw to the top layer any time. The disadvantage was that you were literally sleeping in the same material that covered the entire floor, which had been walked on, potentially urinated on by animals, and incorporated into the house's general ecosystem. Blankets or coverings were usually more layers of clothing. Spare cloaks, old tunics, anything fabric that could be laid over sleeping bodies. Actual woven blankets existed, but were valuable enough to be mentioned in wills. A good woolen blanket could be a family's prized possession, carefully maintained across generations. Most peasants made do with clothing layers, both worn and covering them. The bed, such as it was, became home to a variety of creatures. Fleas were so common that their presence was assumed. You didn't say, "I have fleas." You said, "The fleas are particularly active tonight." Lice took up residence in hair, clothing, and bedding. They were persistent, difficult to eliminate, and accepted as a fact of life. Everyone had lice. Everyone itched. You'd scratch absently while conversing, completely unself-conscious about it. Mites, invisible to the naked eye but definitely felt, burrowed into bedding and bit exposed skin. The bites itched intensely, but there was no effective treatment beyond endurance. Various other insects found the straw and fabric layers hospitable. The medieval bed was a complete ecosystem, supporting diverse life forms in addition to human sleepers. Attempts to reduce pest populations included occasional bed frame fumigation with smoke, or adding certain herbs to straw that pests supposedly disliked. These measures had limited effectiveness. Mostly, you coexisted with your bedmates, human and otherwise. At night, you'd lie down on this crunchy, lumpy, pest-inhabited surface. You'd feel the cold from the ground radiating upward through the compressed straw. You'd shift position, producing rustling sounds and possibly disturbing someone else. And somehow, from exhaustion and lack of alternatives, you'd sleep. Not well, not comfortably, but enough to survive another day. Children who could sleep anywhere adapted quickly. Adults who remembered better conditions or dreamed of them endured. The elderly, whose bones ached and who needed proper rest, suffered but had no choice. The bed was what it was. Morning brought relief from the night's discomfort and the immediate return to the day's work. No one lingered in bed. It wasn't pleasant enough to encourage lounging. The straw bed, for all its awfulness, was still better than nothing. It was better than sleeping directly on frozen ground. It was the best most medieval peasants would ever have. And in a world where so much was harsh and uncomfortable, better than nothing was often the highest achievement available. Even with beds and bodies and fire, the cold still found ways in. Time to patch the holes. Chapter 11. Plugging the leaks. Winter was a constant battle against infiltration. The cold found every weakness, every gap, every crack in your defenses. And medieval houses had abundant weaknesses. The wattle and daub walls, as we discussed, were never perfectly sealed. The mud daubing dried and cracked. The wattle frame underneath shifted with temperature changes and structural settling. By winter, a house that had seemed adequate in autumn had developed dozens of new gaps. You'd feel these as drafts. You'd be sitting near the fire, finally comfortable, when suddenly a stream of cold air would hit the back of your neck. Another gap had opened somewhere. Finding the gap was the first challenge. In darkness, by minimal firelight, you'd have to trace the cold air current back to its source. Sometimes it was obvious. A chunk of daub had fallen away, leaving a fist-sized hole. Sometimes it was subtle. A crack so thin you could barely see it, but wide enough for cold air to pour through. The patching materials were whatever was available. Moss was excellent, if you could find it. It was soft, compressible, and could be stuffed into irregular gaps effectively. Straw could be twisted into bundles and jammed into cracks. Cloth scraps, old rags too worn for any other use, could be stuffed into gaps. Animal hair, collected when grooming livestock or found accumulated in corners, worked surprisingly well. It compacted nicely and provided some insulation. Some families kept a supply of clay or mud specifically for winter repairs. When a gap appeared, you'd mix a small amount of mud, press it into the hole, and hope it dried before freezing. This rarely worked perfectly. The mud would crack again or simply freeze before setting. But it was better than leaving the gap open. The process was ongoing. You'd patch a gap one day, and the next day another would appear. The house was in constant decay, and winter was when that decay became critically dangerous. Roof leaks were particularly problematic. When thatch absorbed water from rain or snow, it grew heavy. The weight caused sagging, created low spots where more water accumulated, which caused more sagging. Eventually, gaps opened in the roof itself. Snow would drift through, landing on sleeping families. Meltwater would drip steadily onto the floor, creating muddy patches and ice when temperatures dropped. Patching roof leaks required climbing up to the roof, which was dangerous in winter. Ice and snow made surfaces slippery. The thatch itself was unstable, but sometimes it had to be done. You'd bundle some spare thatch, climb carefully, and stuff the material into the visible gap. Secure it as best you could, and hope it held until spring when proper repairs could be made. Window coverings required constant maintenance too. The animal hides or oiled cloth that covered window openings would tear or pull away from their fastenings. Cold air would pour through the window gap, creating a focused stream of freezing wind directly into the living space. You'd reattach the covering using whatever fasteners you had. Wooden pegs, leather strips, sometimes just pressing the covering back into place and hoping friction held it. Doors were another challenge. Wooden planks hung on leather hinges or simple iron pins with gaps around all edges. The door itself would swell with moisture or shrink with cold, creating new gaps. Cloth could be hung around door edges, creating a draft barrier. Or straw bundles could be pressed against the base of the door where the largest gaps usually formed. The constant patching, stuffing, and sealing became part of the daily routine. You'd wake, check the fire, and then check the patches. What had failed overnight? Where were the new cold spots? Children would be assigned gap-finding duty. Their smaller size let them get into corners and trace drafts to their sources. Plus, it kept them occupied and taught valuable skills. The work was never finished. You could spend all winter patching gaps and still find new ones. The house was actively fighting you, falling apart faster than you could repair it. But you kept trying, because each sealed gap was a small victory. Each stopped draft meant marginally more warmth retained. In spring, proper repairs could be made. The daub could be completely refreshed, the thatch replaced, the frame strengthened. But winter was about emergency measures, temporary solutions, and accepting that your house would always leak cold no matter what you did. The goal wasn't perfection. It was survival. If enough heat stayed in and enough cold stayed out to keep you alive, you'd won. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold. And every morning that you woke, still breathing, meant you'd held the line one more time. But gaps weren't the only problem. Someone had to make sure everyone actually made it to morning. Chapter 12. The Night Watch. Sleep, in medieval winter, wasn't the unconscious 8-hour rest we aim for today. It was a strategic activity, planned and managed like any other survival task. Someone had to stay awake. The fire demanded it. And so the night watch began, a rotation system that ensured the hearth never went completely unattended. The exact system varied by family, by region, by circumstances. But the principle was universal. Everyone took turns. The first shift usually started shortly after the household settled for sleep. This might be early evening by our standards, but peasants rose with the sun and retired when darkness made work impossible. The first watcher was often a healthy adult, someone capable of managing the fire and handling any problems that arose. They'd sit near the hearth, positioned where they could see the banked coals. Their job was to monitor, not to actively tend the fire, it was banked for the night, but to watch for problems. If coals started to die, they'd add a small amount of fuel. If embers scattered, they'd carefully reposition them. They'd also listen for sounds that meant trouble. Wind picking up, suggesting new drafts appearing. Animals becoming agitated. Children coughing in ways that suggested illness. The shift lasted perhaps 2 or 3 hours, long enough to be tiring, short enough to be survivable. Then came the handoff. The first watcher would wake the second, usually with a gentle shake. Words were unnecessary. The second watcher would rise, groggy and reluctant, and take position by the fire. The first watcher would burrow into the sleeping pile, seeking the warmth their watch partner had just vacated. The second shift was often given to older children or grandparents, anyone who could manage basic fire tending but might need help with emergencies. They'd sit, fighting sleep, trying to stay warm enough near the diminished fire. The house grew colder through the night as heat leaked away and the banked fire provided minimal warmth. This was when the cold was worst. The deepest dark, hours before dawn, when your body wanted desperately to sleep and the temperature dropped to its lowest point. The watcher would pull a cloak tight, maybe move slightly closer to the fire, and endure. Sometimes they'd occupy themselves with small tasks, repairing tools by firelight, mending clothing, anything to stay awake and pass the time. Other times they'd simply stare into the coals, watching the faint glow, thinking whatever thoughts come to exhausted people in the middle of frozen nights. The third shift, if the family was large enough to support 3 rotations, took the hardest slot. The hours just before dawn, when the cold was deepest and sleep was most tempting. This often went to whoever was youngest but reliable. A teenage child, someone strong enough to manage the fire, but too young to be given more critical responsibilities during the day. They'd wake to the sharp elbow of the previous watcher, pull themselves from the warm pile of sleeping bodies, and take up the vigil. The pre-dawn hours were quiet, dark outside and inside, with only the faintest coal glow for light. The sounds of family breathing, animals shifting, wind against walls. This was when accidents happened. The watcher, exhausted, would drowse off. The fire would fail. Or they'd startle awake, realize they'd been sleeping, and find the coals cold and gray. That meant the long, difficult process of restarting fire from scratch. With frozen fingers, in darkness, with flint and steel and prayer. Most nights, most watchers managed to stay awake. Most mornings, the coals survived until dawn, when the final watcher would begin actively rebuilding the fire for the new day. But some nights, exhaustion won. Some mornings brought cold hearths and the grim work of making new fire while the family shivered awake. The night watch was exhausting. No one got uninterrupted sleep. Everyone woke multiple times, either for their watch shift or disturbed by others moving around. Children learned young that this was simply how winter worked. You slept in fragments, stayed vigilant, took your turn at the watch. The elderly, who often slept lightly anyway, sometimes took longer shifts. They had experience managing fires, and their aching joints made lying on straw beds uncomfortable anyway. What sleep came was shallow, interrupted, never truly restful. You'd wake tired every morning, aware that tonight would be the same, and the night after that. This went on for months. November to March, night after night, the rotating watch keeping the fire alive and the family surviving. Modern people complain about sleep deprivation from jobs or new babies. Medieval peasants might note that at least you're not also freezing to death while sleep deprived. The night watch was survival. It was the price of seeing morning, and every family paid it, every winter, for generation after generation. Because the fire demanded attention, and attention required consciousness, and consciousness meant someone had to sacrifice sleep. So they took turns, they endured, and they kept the embers alive until dawn. Even breathing wrong could make the cold worse. Peasants learned to control even that. Chapter 13. Survival. Breathing and hot rocks. Some survival strategies were large and obvious. Others were small, almost invisible, but equally important. The way you breathed was one of these. In deep cold, breathing deeply through your mouth pulls frigid air directly into your lungs. This causes several problems. First, it hurts. Cold air hitting lung tissue creates a sharp, painful sensation. Anyone who's gasped in freezing weather knows this feeling. Second, it cools your core body temperature. Your lungs are close to your heart, to major blood vessels. Cold air there means cold blood circulating through your body. Third, it irritates the respiratory system. Deep, cold breathing leads to coughing, which leads to lung problems, which in medieval times could easily become fatal pneumonia. So peasants learned to breathe differently in winter. Shallow breaths, not deep ones. You don't need to fully fill your lungs with each breath when you're sleeping or resting. Shallow breathing reduces the volume of cold air entering your body. Through the nose, not the mouth. The nasal passages warm incoming air somewhat before it reaches the lungs. It's not much, but it's something. Your nose has blood vessels close to the surface specifically for this purpose. Air passing through gets warmed by contact with these vessels. Mouth breathing bypasses this natural warming system, delivering colder air directly to the lungs. Peasants would teach children to keep their mouths closed at night, to breathe only through the nose. It became habit, an unconscious adaptation to winter. Some people took it further, covering their faces partially with cloth while sleeping. A cloak pulled up over the nose and mouth, or a cloth wrapped loosely around the face. This created a small air pocket where your breath could warm the space slightly before being inhaled again. You'd rebreathe some of your exhaled air, which was warmer than the ambient air. The downside was moisture. Your breath contains water vapor, which would condense on the cloth covering your face. By morning, you'd have a damp, possibly frozen cloth clinging to your face. But damp and uncomfortable beat pneumonia, so the trade-off was accepted. This careful breathing technique was passed down through observation and instruction. Parents would correct children who were mouth breathing, reminding them to close their mouths, breathe slowly and shallowly. It became automatic, like so many other winter adaptations. You didn't think about it. Your body just knew that winter meant different breathing. Beyond breathing, peasants had other small comfort strategies. One of the most effective involved rocks. Stones have mass and density. When heated, they retain warmth for hours. This makes them excellent portable heat sources. The process was simple, but required planning. Before bed, you'd select a smooth, flat stone. Size mattered, large enough to hold significant heat, small enough to handle safely. You'd place this stone directly in the hearth fire, positioning it where it would get hot, but not where it would be in the way of fire tending. The stone would heat slowly through the evening. By bedtime, it would be almost too hot to touch. Using a stick or improvised tongs, you'd remove the hot stone from the fire. This step had to be done carefully. Drop a glowing hot stone and you'd crack it, possibly starting a fire, definitely creating a problem. The stone needed to be wrapped immediately. Cloth was the usual choice. Old rags, worn-out clothing, anything that could provide a barrier between the hot stone and human flesh. Too thin a wrapping, and the stone would burn through and potentially burn you. Too thick, and the heat wouldn't transmit effectively. The wrapped hot stone would then be placed in the sleeping area. Common positions included
at the foot of the bed,
Warming feet. Cold feet were a particular misery, and warm feet made the entire body feel warmer. In the middle of the sleeping pile, where it could radiate warmth to multiple people. This required careful positioning so no one could accidentally contact the stone directly. Wrapped and placed under the straw mattress, where it would warm the bed from below, counteracting the frozen ground somewhat. The stone would stay warm for hours. Not fire hot, but noticeably warm, radiating gentle heat into its surroundings. By morning, it would be merely a cold stone again, ready to be returned to the hearth for the next night. This was medieval technology at its finest. Simple, effective, using materials that cost nothing and providing real comfort. The risks were real too. Improperly wrapped stones caused burns. Stones that were cracked could shatter when heated, sending hot fragments flying. Some stones, particularly river rocks that had absorbed water, could actually explode when heated rapidly, as internal moisture turned to steam. So peasants learned which stones were safe, which shapes and types held heat best, and exactly how to handle them. Children were usually kept away from hot stone duty. The risk of burns was too high. This was a job for responsible adults who understood the dangers. But the warmth, the genuine physical comfort of a hot stone at your feet on a freezing night, that was worth the effort and the risk. Another pre-sleep strategy involved food. Eating a substantial meal before bed served multiple purposes. Digestion generates heat. Your body, working to break down food, produces warmth as a byproduct. This internal heating could make a real difference through the night. The meal itself needed to be heavy, substantial. Dense bread, thick grain porridge, root vegetables. Foods that would digest slowly, providing extended warmth. Fats were particularly valuable. They take longer to digest than carbohydrates, providing a longer-lasting heat source. If you had access to meat, even small amounts, or to butter, cheese, any fatty food, you'd eat it before bed in winter. Your stomach, full and working, became a small furnace inside your body. Combined with the external warmth from shared bodies and possibly a hot stone, you'd have a fighting chance at sleep. Of course, eating heavily before bed had its own consequences. Vivid dreams, digestive discomfort, and the need to relieve yourself during the night, which meant leaving the warm pile and braving the freezing house. But these inconveniences were minor compared to the alternative of trying to sleep hungry and cold. Parents ensured children ate their fill at the evening meal. Picky eating wasn't tolerated in winter. You ate what was provided, fully and without complaint. The meal, the hot stone, the careful breathing, the pile of bodies, all these strategies combined to create survivable sleeping conditions. None of them alone would be enough. Together, they made the difference between waking up and not. Individual tricks helped, but no one survived a medieval winter alone. Chapter 14. The Village Safety Net. Medieval villages were tight communities by necessity. You knew your neighbors intimately because your survival often depended on them. In winter, this interdependence became critical. No single family had enough resources to weather the worst alone. Everyone needed help sometimes. The village, despite its feuds and tensions, functioned as a survival collective. Every morning, people would look at their neighbors' houses. Specifically, they'd look at the roofs. Smoke rising from the roof hole meant the fire was alive. The family was functional. No smoke meant potential disaster. If your neighbor's smoke didn't appear by mid-morning, you'd go check on them, knock on the door, call out, make sure they were alive and the fire hadn't died. Sometimes the fire had just been slow to start. The family would be awake, working on rebuilding flames from banked coals, grateful for the check-in, but fine. Other times, you'd find real problems. The fire had died completely during the night. The family was huddled together, freezing, unable to restart it with numb fingers and damp tinder. This is when the village network activated. You'd rush home, Grab a live coal from your own hearth, wrap it in damp cloth or place it in a small clay pot and rush it back. A live coal could restart a dead hearth in minutes. Add kindling, blow gently, and flames would return. Crisis averted. This coal sharing was so common it was barely noteworthy. Of course you'd share fire. Next week, it might be you who needed it. Some villages had designated fire keepers, usually older women who stayed home, who were good at managing fires and who could be relied upon to have coals available. If your fire died, you'd go to the fire keeper's home, borrow a coal, and restart your hearth. The fire keeper would keep a small clay pot ready specifically for this purpose. She'd place the coal inside, you'd carry it home carefully, and return the pot later. No payment was expected. This was community survival infrastructure. Food sharing was more complex because food was scarce. But in the hardest times, villages would pool resources. If one family's stored grain ran out, neighbors would contribute small amounts. A cup of barley here, some dried peas there. Not enough to impoverish the givers, but enough to keep the receivers alive. This wasn't charity in the modern sense. It was insurance. You helped them this winter, they'd help you when your turn came. Some villages had communal food stores, managed by the village elders or the local church. Families would contribute a portion of their harvest, and in winter, the neediest would receive distributions. These systems were informal, flexible, and imperfect, but they prevented the worst outcomes more often than not. Shared labor was another critical element. If your roof developed a serious leak midwinter, you couldn't fix it alone. You needed help. Neighbors would gather, despite the cold, and work together to patch the roof. Multiple people made the work faster and safer. You'd repay this help through your own labor when needed, perhaps helping with their repairs or working extra during harvest season. Everything was tracked mentally, a complex web of mutual obligations that everyone understood without needing to write it down. Children played a crucial role in the village network. They were messengers, running between houses with information and small items. Mother says, "Can she borrow a cup of grain? She'll return it after next market." Father needs help with the roof. Can you come this afternoon? Grandmother hasn't been seen today. Can you check on her? These small communications kept the village functioning, kept everyone connected and aware. Elderly villagers who couldn't do heavy labor often served as watchers and advisors. They'd sit near their windows, observing village activity, noticing when something was wrong. An old woman would notice that a particular family's children hadn't come out to play. She'd mention it to someone, who'd go check, discovering that the children were ill and the family needed help. This informal surveillance system meant very little happened without someone noticing. Privacy was impossible, but safety was enhanced. The village also shared knowledge and skills. If someone had successfully weatherproofed their home using a new technique, others would learn from them. If someone knew how to treat frostbite or had a remedy for winter coughs, that knowledge spread quickly. Survival strategies were communal property, refined through generations, shared freely because everyone benefited. Winter divided villages into those who helped and those who didn't. The hoarders, the selfish, the ones who refused to share anything, they were remembered. Come spring, when cooperation was needed for planting, those who'd refused winter help found fewer volunteers. Social pressure enforced cooperation. You maintained your reputation by being generous, helpful, reliable. Not from pure altruism, but from enlightened self-interest. You'd need help eventually. Better to build goodwill now. Churches, where they existed, played a role too. Parish priests would sometimes maintain small stores of grain or fuel to distribute to the neediest. They'd also organize communal prayers for protection from cold, from illness, from the various dangers of winter. Whether these prayers had practical effect is debatable, but they provided psychological comfort and reinforced community bonds. The village was, in many ways, a larger family. Dysfunctional, argumentative, occasionally hostile, but fundamentally committed to collective survival. Individual families couldn't make it alone. Together, most of them made it to spring. Not all. Winter always took some. But the village safety net meant that more survived than would have otherwise. In our modern world of isolated households and anonymous neighbors, this level of interdependence seems foreign, perhaps even uncomfortable. To medieval peasants, it was simply how life worked. You helped because you'd need help. You gave because you'd need to receive. The alternative was freezing alone in a dark house, and no one wanted that. But even with all these strategies, winter still won sometimes. Chapter 15. When Winter Won. We've talked about survival strategies, clever adaptations, community support. But we need to acknowledge the hard truth. Not everyone made it to spring. Medieval winter killed people, regularly. The strategies we've discussed improved odds but didn't guarantee survival. Every village had families who didn't survive a particularly harsh winter. Sometimes entire households found frozen when neighbors finally broke down the door. Usually they'd be found huddled together, the final position they took, seeking warmth from each other. The youngest at the center, the parents forming an outer shell, dead together. The fire had gone out, or the fuel had run out, or illness had struck and weakened everyone past the point where they could maintain warmth. Whatever the specific cause, the result was the same. The line between alive and frozen had been crossed, and they'd ended up on the wrong side. These deaths weren't always quick. Hypothermia is a gradual process. First, you shiver violently. Then you become confused, sluggish. Eventually, you feel paradoxically warm and calm. Then you stop. Children were particularly vulnerable. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster. Their metabolisms couldn't sustain warmth as effectively as adults. Infant mortality in winter was significantly higher than in summer. Some babies simply didn't have the reserves to survive the cold. Parents would wake to find a child cold beside them, having died quietly during the night. No dramatic symptoms, no warning, just gone. The elderly faced similar vulnerabilities. Age reduced circulation, decreased the body's ability to generate heat. Elderly peasants often didn't survive harsh winters. Families knew this. They'd do their best to protect aging parents or grandparents, but sometimes their best wasn't enough. Frostbite took fingers and toes, ears and noses. The blackened, dead tissue would eventually fall off or be amputated with whatever tools were available. Losing toes impaired your ability to work, to walk properly. In a world where physical labor was survival, this could be a slow death sentence. Losing fingers was equally devastating. You needed fingers for almost every task. Without them, you became dependent on others' help, a burden when resources were already stretched. Illness spread rapidly in the crowded, smoky conditions of winter homes. Respiratory infections were common. The smoke irritation, the constant dampness, the inability to properly isolate sick individuals. What we'd call pneumonia or bronchitis killed many. Their lungs filled with fluid, they coughed and struggled to breathe, and eventually they drowned internally. There were no antibiotics, no effective treatments. You either recovered through your body's own strength, or you didn't. Tuberculosis thrived in crowded winter conditions. The chronic cough, the wasting away, the months-long decline. Entire families could be infected, watching each other deteriorate. Malnutrition weakened everyone by late winter. Food stores ran low. The grain was moldy, the preserved vegetables depleted. Bodies running on insufficient nutrition couldn't fight illness or maintain warmth effectively. Spring was called the starving time in many regions. The winter stores were exhausted, but new crops weren't ready. People ate anything, grass, bark, whatever could fill stomachs. Some didn't make it through this final hunger period, dying within sight of spring after surviving the worst of winter's cold. Accidents killed too, falling through ice while trying to get water, roofs collapsing under snow weight, fires spreading out of control in the desperately dry interiors of winter homes. Each death diminished the community. Each loss meant fewer people to share labor, fewer hands for the spring planting. But medieval peasants couldn't afford extended mourning. The dead were buried, or more often, stored frozen until the ground thawed enough for burial. And life continued. The survivors had to keep surviving. Children still needed feeding. Fires still needed tending. Winter didn't pause for grief. There's a hardness to this that modern sensibilities find difficult, but it was necessary. You grieved while working. You remembered while surviving. You honored the dead by refusing to join them. Village records, when they exist, show the winter toll. Parish registers list burials clustered in January, February, March. More deaths than births, communities shrinking through the cold months. Spring would bring recovery. The surviving families would plant, would rebuild, would have children to replace those lost. But every winter was a test, and not everyone passed. The strategies we've discussed, the fire banking, the body piles, the hot stones, the community support, these improved survival rates significantly. Without them, the death toll would have been catastrophic. With them, it was merely tragic. Medieval peasants knew winter was dangerous. They prepared as best they could. They helped each other. They endured. And most of them survived to see spring. Not all, but most. The ones who didn't survive aren't named in history books. They weren't nobles or knights. They were ordinary people who fought the cold and lost. We should remember them. The nameless ones who froze in their homes, who died trying to keep their families warm, who gave up their warmth to shield children who died anyway. They're part of this story too. Price of winter, paid by those who couldn't afford it. Yet somehow, generation after generation, enough people survived to pass their knowledge forward. Chapter 16. The Legacy of the Cold. We've spent hours now in the cold and dark of medieval winter. Let's step back and consider what all of this means. These survival strategies, the mud walls, the banked fires, the piles of bodies and animals, the strategic filth, weren't just interesting historical details. They were humanity's answer to an existential challenge. How do you survive when nature is actively trying to kill you and you have almost nothing to work with? The ingenuity on display is remarkable. Peasants understood, through experience if not through science, principles of thermodynamics and heat retention. They knew that trapped air insulated, that mass retained heat, that bodies in proximity created warmth, that wind was the enemy and stillness was an ally. They figured out fire banking, that ash could preserve embers overnight, that the exact amount of coverage mattered. They understood that clothing could be improved by dirt, that cleanliness and warmth were sometimes at odds, that survival trumped comfort. They built social systems that spread risk, that ensured no family faced winter completely alone. All of this knowledge was developed over generations, refined through trial and error, passed down through teaching and observation. The ones who got it wrong didn't survive to pass on their mistakes. The ones who got it right taught their children, who taught theirs, creating an unbroken chain of survival knowledge. This is human adaptation at its most fundamental. No advanced technology, no external rescue, just people figuring out how to not die using whatever was available. And what was available wasn't much. Mud and sticks and animal dung, straw and smoke and unwashed wool. Each other. That's it. That's what stood between medieval peasants and freezing to death. It's humbling in a way. We, with our climate control and insulation and emergency services, still complain about being cold. They, with nothing but cleverness and community, survived winters that would kill us in days. This isn't to romanticize medieval life. It was hard. It was miserable. It was dangerous. People died regularly from things we'd consider minor inconveniences. But there's something worth recognizing in their resilience. They didn't quit. They didn't give up. They faced winter after winter, knowing the risks, and they endured. The community bonds formed by shared survival were deep. When you've huddled with someone for warmth, when they've shared their fire with you, when you've kept watch together through frozen nights, those connections matter. Modern communities often lack this level of interdependence. We don't need our neighbors for survival. We barely know our neighbors. Medieval peasants knew everyone in their village intimately. They had to. Survival was collective. There's loss in our modern independence, even as there's obvious gain. We're warmer, safer, healthier, but perhaps more isolated. The knowledge peasants possessed, how to manage fire, how to read weather, how to work together, was vital and sophisticated. Much of it has been lost. We don't need to know how to bank a fire because we have thermostats. We don't need to know which herbs repel pests because we have pesticides. Our ignorance is a luxury. We can afford not to know these things because we have alternatives. But in every warm house tonight, in every comfortable bed, there's an echo of those medieval solutions. We're still solving the same problem, how to stay warm in winter, just with better tools. Central heating is just a very advanced hearth. Insulation is just very effective daubing. Houses are still wind barriers, bedrooms are still sleeping chambers. The principles haven't changed, only the methods have improved. When you adjust your thermostat tonight, spare a thought for the person who had to wake up at 2 a.m. to check the coals. When you pull up your comfortable blanket, remember the person sleeping in unwashed wool on compressed straw, sharing space with a goat. When you wake up warm and rested, think of the person who woke up exhausted and cold, grateful simply to have survived another night. We're connected to them, not by blood necessarily, but by shared humanity, by the common experience of facing winter and finding ways to endure. They solved problems we don't have anymore, but they were solving them for us, in a sense. Every generation that survived ensured the next generation existed. Your ancestors, whoever they were, survived winters. Maybe they were nobles in castles with slightly better conditions. Maybe they were peasants in mud huts with nothing but determination. But they survived. Because you're here reading this, they must have survived. And their survival, in whatever form it took, is why you exist. That's the legacy of the cold. Not just historical knowledge, but the literal foundation of your existence. Every person alive today is descended from people who survived winters before modern heating, who endured the cold, who found ways to stay warm, who made it through to spring often enough to reproduce. We carry their resilience in our genes, even if we never need to use it. The medieval peasant, shivering in their smoky hut, surrounded by family and livestock, breathing carefully through their nose, hoping the fire lasts until morning. They're not just history, they're your ancestor. They're everyone's ancestor in some form, and they deserve recognition. Not pity, but respect. They didn't conquer winter. Winter was never conquered, not really. Even now, with all our technology, winter still kills people who aren't prepared. But they coexisted with winter. They learned its patterns, understood its dangers, and developed strategies that worked often enough to keep humanity going. Smoke-filled houses are gone. The mud and dung walls have crumbled. The specific people have been dead for centuries. But the legacy remains. In every warm home, in every person who survived a winter, in every community that helps its vulnerable members. Medieval peasants taught us that survival is possible even in impossible conditions, that ingenuity and cooperation can overcome tremendous challenges, that the line between alive and frozen is thin, but it can be held if you're clever and committed and willing to help each other. Next time the wind howls outside your window, remember them. The nameless ones who refused to freeze, who faced the cold with nothing but straw and smoke and stubborn determination, who survived winter nights that would kill us, and who, impossibly, made it to spring. Thank you for joining me on this journey into medieval winter. If you found this exploration worthwhile, A like helps others discover these stories. Subscribe for more calm historical deep dives. Let me know in the comments what historical topic you'd like to explore next. And sleep well, wherever you are. Appreciate your warm bed tonight. It's a luxury countless generations never had. Good night.